Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be asking, is the government's counter-terrorism strategy working in light of the horrific murder of Sir David Amess MP? So joining me in this programme today, I'm joined by Johnny Gould from the Jewish State podcast. Warm welcome to the programme, as well as David Curtin, the founder and leader of the Heritage Party. So welcome to the programme. And Johnny, it's great to have you on Politics Today. So
to be here.
For our viewers who don't know who you are, because you're a famous sports broadcaster, and now you're doing great work for Israel and the Jewish people, can you describe a little bit about what you do through your podcasts and your vast experience of journalism?
Simon, thank you very much for having me today. I stumbled upon a passion, an idea about 3 years ago, but I didn't realise how deep the project would go. I sat and watched two brigadier generals from the IDF, the Israel Defence Force, who came to London off their own back. They weren't members of the government. And their objective was to try and find people in Parliament, both in the House of Lords and House of Commons, to endorse their own peace plan. Because as brigadier generals, they would know more about the defence of the State of Israel, perhaps even more than politicians themselves. And so they came up with a project called the New State Solution. I'm talking about Sergeant Benjamin Anthony and Brigadier General Amir Avivi. And the most fascinating thing about these guys is they, as I say, they weren't part of the Netanyahu government. They were just guys who really believed in their mission. And they were here to meet members of the House of Lords and people from the Egyptian embassy. Great. And their plan was as follows. Now, it's been superseded in the following years by the Abraham Accords and by the phenomenal signings of Bahrain and Morocco, Sudan, the UAE, etc., and the emboldenment of the Jordan deal with the Hashemite kingdom. But their plan was to create a Palestinian state out of Gaza and northern Sinai, which of course is Egypt at the moment, and will be for the foreseeable future, and to finally assume full statehood of Judea and Samaria for the State of Israel, and that generous population packages of movement from Judea and Samaria to Gaza and the North Sinai would be arranged, but critically, no one would be forced to move anywhere. No Jews would be forced out of Judea and Samaria. No Arabs would be forced to move to Gaza or North Sinai, because of course we have seen in 20th century history terrible disasters when populations have moved both throughout the Middle East. 850,000 Jews were displaced out of Arab countries across the region when the State of Israel was formed, and in the years after. And of course, we all know about partition, India and Pakistan. Terrible, terrible violence ensued. So there was no population movement. What a great idea. So I sat down with these guys, and I think they were quite bowled over that someone from the media was interested, which surprised me. So I sat with them in their hotel, we interviewed them, and I thought, right, that's episode 1. Now what? And I thought, right, episode 2, I need to crack on. It needs to be as good as the previous guests. And
that's always a challenge.
Well, yeah. So I thought, well, who do I know? You know, who's famous? Who's someone I know? And I thought about the libel lawyer Mark Lewis, who has been a very, very influential libel lawyer in the UK, a friend of mine. He'd just gone to live in Israel, so I wanted him to reflect on life in Israel, aged early 50s. You know, what's it like as a grown man, and his wife, his partner Mandy, to go to Israel not as a teenager, not in their early 20s. You know, what's it like? He sort of spoke the language. You know, what's he going to do? And so that was episode 2. And then I was off on a roll. The audience started to grow, and the project has become deeper and deeper, and it has totally changed me. I still am to a certain extent a sports journalist, but I must tell you, sitting down with this amount of wisdom, like this, sitting down with you guys and talking about, you know, conundra, you know, difficult subjects, how to solve them in an environment of goodwill and peace and harmony. Let's just try and get the other side to agree with us. Is just a wonderfully satisfying project. I'm on episode 70 something now, and try and stop me.
Excellent. We're going to draw upon your wisdom later, Johnny. And David, it's great to be with you on this edition of Politics Today. Sadly, we have to reflect on the horrific murder of Sir David Amess MP at his constituency, which was shocking because he stood up for Christian values. He was also the honorary chairman of Conservative Friends of Israel. He stood up for the unborn as well. And sadly, I think Parliament has lost a great Conservative MP. What are your thoughts on his tragic murder?
It was shocking and it was horrible. And when it happened, I was actually in Essex at the time. I was visiting someone else up there. He's not someone that I heard of beforehand, but the more I hear about him and what he did, he was a good MP who actually is one of these people who just quietly behind the scenes does a lot of good work for a lot of good causes. I mean, he stood up for animal rights even, saying he wanted an end to the sort of battery cages for chickens and so on, which is something I know a lot of people care about. As you said, he was in the Conservative Friends of Israel, and he was stood up for pro-life. He was also trying to look at the influence of big pharmaceutical companies on government policy, which is something else that was mentioned as well. So that he did an awful lot of really good things, and it's a shock that an MP was murdered like this in such a horrific way. I'm going to hold judgment upon the motivation for that, but we've clearly got a suspect. You know, we do believe in innocent until proven guilty. So there'll be a trial, and we'll find out what the motivations were. I mean, there's a variety of different things that it could be, but certainly this is a horrendous thing to happen, and it's not something you expect to happen. Particularly after 5 years ago, the murder of Joe Cox, and then also Stephen Timms, another Christian MP, was attacked by, in this case we know, an Islamist I think in his constituency. That was 2010, I think, just 11 years ago. So we have to stop this from happening again.
And John, isn't this a fundamental assault on our democracy aimed to stop the access between our political representatives and the public, so that our politicians build walls themselves against the public because they're afraid that a random constituency member, even not a constituency member, could actually murder them?
Yeah, Simon, I'm darned if I'm going to change the way I conduct my life. I mean, the amount of friends that were alarmed by 7/7, or I'm not going to go on a tube or a bus tomorrow. Why not?
Absolutely.
Don't change what you do. If something terrible happens in Israel, your friends say, well, I'm not going to go and support the state of Israel. Go and see your family. Don't change because a violent minority, because that's what they are, want you to be scared. Don't be scared. And that's one of the most important lessons. And I think, when you say, David, you hadn't heard of Sir David Amess, I mean, that really says everything about him, the humility with which he conducted his public service. The man could have been a minister. The man could have been a Secretary of State. He was a fantastic constituency MP. Not that there aren't great ministers and Secretary of States, and there's nothing wrong with ambition. But every time the phone rang suggesting a promotion if he did this and that, he sort of laughed it off and cared about Southend.
You're right.
And Westcliff, and he was a friend to everyone. And he often said, I don't understand anti-Semitism, and that would probably go for any form of racism. I don't understand it. He was a very, very good man and a wonderful public servant, and it is why this should happen to him, a spiritual question as opposed to an earthly question, is something we have to really reach for in our faith, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And David, it seems like his assailant, his name's Ali Harbi Ali, was of Somali descent, was radicalised by Ahmad Chowdhury's preaching online. So the big question is the government's prevent strategy, is its strategy to combat Islamic extremism failing when these hate preachers like Ahmad Chowdhury videos are online and easily accessible to anybody, especially since lockdown, when these radicals have had nothing else to do apart from listening to messages of hate and incitement to violence and terrorism?
I think it is failing to a very large extent because, as I said, I'm going to hold judgment on this particular case, but certainly there are other cases, and there have been many other Islamist terrorist attacks, particularly in 2017. You had the London Bridge attack, the Westminster Bridge attack, you had the Manchester Arena bombings, you had the Parsons Green tube bombing, which mercifully didn't kill anybody. You also have many Islamist terrorist attacks around the world. We know, 84%, I think, of terrorist attacks around the world globally are Islamist. So we certainly have a very specific problem. And in this country, it seems that people who carry out Islamist terrorist attacks, much of the time, are homegrown. So they're people who are born and raised in this country and are radicalized in this country. Now, that could be online by looking at preachers in their bedrooms and so on. But I think much of it is what happens in person-to-person, face-to-face contact with people in radical mosques. And there's a lot of influence from the Wahhabi sect, the Deobandi sect, that are very radical, that take a literal interpretation of some of the verses in the Quran, which do advocate violence. Now, not everybody interprets them in some ways. You've got peaceful groups like the Ahmadiyya Muslims. Indeed, you had an Ahmadiyya Muslim in Glasgow, I think it's Asad Shah, who was murdered by a radical Deobandi who travelled up to Glasgow from the West Yorkshire area to kill him, because he wished people a happy Christmas. So you've got within the Muslim community in this country people who are being radicalized. I think we'd have to look at the person-to-person contact just as much as looking online.
And Johnny, sadly, with so many of these Islamists, deep in their ideology is this fundamental hatred of the Jewish people. And we know that, for example, when it comes to Jew hatred, that is God's early warning system, that once the Jewish people come under attack, then the rest of society is under threat. Do you think the government is taking seriously some of these Islamic extremists and their extreme anti-Semitic views, because they're being radicalized from the Middle East, from various social media sites, from TV stations in the region? They can read Arabic, and this then so therefore, as well as so many immigrants coming in from the Middle East, they're exporting this jihadi anti-Semitism that we're seeing today that seems to be out of control.
Simon, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews, and we've seen terrible assaults on our nation. Sir David Amess only recently, and of course the awful Ariana Grande disaster, and all the others that you've mentioned so far as well, David. I wish it was taken more seriously. We are living in a culture war where different messages are delivered and certain campaigns are compromised in terms of our security. These are security issues for our country. There is a subterranean current of alliances. I know that Britain and Israel do talk on a military level, on an intelligence level, because they have to, because Israel is under the same attack as Britain and has common enemies. But there are too many people in this country that don't understand the extent of the enemy that Britain faces. There are some MPs who do that. Michael Gove has talked in a very positive way. Of course, we know the great Lord Austin, of course, himself has Holocaust surviving ancestry. And they have stood up and been extremely brave in the mainstream. But how many more of these awful disasters are we going to experience in this country before policy becomes more stringent?
Absolutely. And David, you were a member of the London Assembly, and because you stood on Christian values, you faced a whole series of abuse from other Assembly members. Do you think that politics now has become so toxic that if anyone doesn't represent a certain viewpoint, namely from the radical left, you become a target? And isn't there a danger that when we see other Assembly members, for example, attack yourself, this can encourage other extremists then to either lash out on social media against you, or then the worst case scenario of what happened to Sir David Amess is that you become a target.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I received abuse, what I would call abuse, from other assembly members when I didn't vote for certain motions in the London Assembly, and they expected everybody to fall in line and agree with what is the current narrative, the current politically correct position. I mean, there was a motion on, what we could call gender or traditional family values. I was the only person not to vote for it. A lot of the Labour MPs then stood up, well, not MPs, the Assembly members, then sort of roundly condemned me. Even one of the Conservative members actually likened me at one point to a Nazi. You can see that, you can see what was said, and the clip that has been put out there, just for not having the right opinion. So I think that there's a lot of willingness to attack people who have perhaps got conservative opinions, but going back to what Johnny said there's not a willingness. In fact, they want to sort of divert anyone away from actually questioning what is the root of anti-Semitism in this country, and the sort of attacks on that we've seen, the terrorist attacks. And one thing I did when I was in the London Assembly is I asked a question, because in the whole narrative of hate crime, there's all the crimes that we have. They're very, very willing to compile statistics about what is anti-Semitic, what's Islamophobic, what's homophobic, what's misogynist, and so on, in terms of the victims. But then I asked the question, have you got statistics on the perpetrators? So we know what are the ethnic origins and gender origins of the people who are committing the crimes. And the answer I got back was, no, we can't do that. It would be too much. It would be too difficult to work that out. We'd have to go through each individual case and see. So there's really not a willingness at all to actually look at who is carrying out anti-Semitic crime in the country, for example. Those figures, I'm sure they know, but they're not willing to tell us. So we can't actually address it properly.
Yeah. Johnny, one of the sad facts is that the biggest threat facing the Jewish community is from Islamists. They've been carrying out violent attacks, and this is why, if you ever go to a Jewish school, it's almost like an armed fortress. This is why synagogues have to have security. It's why the Jewish community has to pay a huge amount for the community security trust to protect our very precious Jewish community. But that is not going to make any Jewish people feel really safe. And if we compare, for example, the UK to that of France or Brussels, and I've worked in the European Parliament, literally you have soldiers with machine guns outside the Jewish Museum and armed escorts as well. So this isn't a future for our Jewish community if this problem is not tackled. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. This is a very serious state of affairs. All the synagogues in France have, as you say, machine-gunned public servants outside. We have muscle security guards, and the design of new synagogues are built with sentry posts and guards. The door is made of steel. The walls are higher. And this is a very sad indictment of our society. A synagogue in Hampstead was daubed from the entrance right up to the Hampstead High Street with a hard left conspiracy theory daubing of a Star of David with 9/11 written underneath it. The obvious connotation being that it was, I don't know, an Israeli conspiracy or something, 9/11, go figure. And the protests continued. What looked like, on the surface, support for the Jewish community in the area was actually carried out by people in sympathy for the people that daubed it, I'm afraid to say. There was a We Shall Overcome vigil of hard left supporters there. And when a very brave television journalist by the name of Joseph Cohen, the Israel Advocacy Movement, confronted them to try and find out who they were, because on the surface you might think that they were supporters of the Jewish community. He was told very clearly, my support is with us, not with you. What a terrible moment that is to hear, as basically windows were smashed and graffiti was removed. We have to work very, very hard to improve race relations, to confront this enemy within, because as you said, Simon, before, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And it is no coincidence that in a pluralistic society, we've just got to tolerate each other, and that leads to a more successful society, whoever you are.
And David, do you think that the social media giants are complicit in this, primarily for allowing so much hate material, incitement material? It was only a couple of years ago that many journalists were complaining, for example, that they could watch ISIS YouTube videos and learn how to make a bomb, for example. And knowing also, according to news reports, there's something like 43,000 jihadis in this country that our security services are monitoring. And of course, that's a huge number. And that's not forgetting those who haven't been monitored by our security services. So do you think that one of the solutions to combating this spread of Islamic extremism is to actually tackle the incitement issue head on, and that is the involvement of our social media companies providing a platform for these jihadis to be radicalised?
I think you've got to be very careful about putting censorship, a blanket censorship on social media companies, because they're platforms, and you don't want to stop people from, you know, having legitimate opinions and legitimate debate and discussion on there. But anything that incites violence or incites crime, they should take it down. I mean, that's essentially just what should happen automatically. And I think they do to some extent, but sometimes there's a bit of a delay in how they can do it. You know, they can't. There's so much coming at some platforms from people, and not just people, bots. You know, we have, for example, the story which was in the newspapers quite recently when England lost the final of the European Cup, and the three people who missed the goals were all black. And so there was a huge amount of online hate directed at those three players. But we since found out most of it was based abroad, and an awful lot of it was from bot accounts. So not individual people, but people setting up, you know, armies. They have banks of mobile phones, right, churning out thousands of messages every hour, you know, to, you know, incite hatred, if you like. I don't know what the purpose of that is. You can't blame individual people for that, but you've got to deal with the people, the armies of bots that do this, and the people who are behind that, rather than trying to blame individual people in this country. And yeah, I think sometimes social media companies are overwhelmed by this. They do have a part to play. They should try to close down these bot accounts and only let on people who are, you know, real people, for example. But you've got to strike a balance between requiring them to get rid of things that are against the law, that incite violence, but still allowing free speech.
Absolutely. And Johnny, what's your thoughts on social media? Because it's a great outlet in terms of creating the whole concept of a citizen journalist. It's levelling up in terms of the mainstream media and an alternative journalistic viewpoint, yes. Which I think is essential, but we also see can be used for a platform of hate, incitement of violence, and support of terrorism.
David is absolutely right. It gives a voice to people that simply would not have access to mainstream media, and that should continue. It's a very American idea, isn't it, of you know, hyper free speech, which is kind of what America stands for. We have slightly more controls in this country. I'd say slightly, quite a lot of more controls than the US has in its history, some of it extremely checkered. I was involved in what was an awful pile-on to Aston Villa's Facebook page, just wishing people happy Passover. Very nice, claret and blue happy Passover, never seen it in those colours before. Very nice. From all your friends at Aston Villa, 27,000 hate messages, but genuine. And they came from the Middle East. Just because Egypt had two players, the captain and their star player, were in our first team at the time. Trezeguet and El Mohammadi, and Villa fans complained before that on match days, if Trezeguet was dropped, they'd just get an absolute hate fest of Egyptian fans targeting the Aston Villa Facebook page. I alerted Villa to it. They put a message underneath it saying, "We do not tolerate racism, we're an inclusive football club and everyone's welcome," which among the sea of other noise was rather difficult to see. It was an issue for Facebook and they haven't dealt with it. Whether you would argue either taking it down is a good thing or whether it stays as a monument to the hate forever is a matter we can discuss, but it was a very torrid incident and the beginning of my disengagement, I'm sorry to say, with the Supporters Trust. And these things are international pressures. Hate appears to sell on Facebook and Twitter. They are light touch in terms of what they're doing. They could do a whole lot more. I don't really exactly know why they're not doing it. Whilst they don't do anything about it, it seems they're tacitly in support of it.
So, David, we've got a minute and a half left of the programme. Certainly could go on for another half an hour, that's for sure. But what can we do to protect our democracy? Because our democracy and our freedoms are so precious, they are so cherished, and we have such an incredible history of democratic values that we know that the opponents to democracy would like to destroy our democracy. How can we speak up and defend the liberty that we have and that we've been inherited from our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation?
I think it comes back to something that Johnny said. We should just carry on living life as normal and not be afraid. And we need to realise here that we have a homicide rate in this country which is very low compared to many other countries. It's about 12 people per year per million. In the United States, it's 53 people per million. In South Africa, it's over 500. So we shouldn't be afraid of these things. These things are terrible. We need to deal with them, but we need to carry on exercising our freedom.
David and Johnny, thank you so much for being my guests on this edition of Politics Today. And I want to thank you for watching this programme. We have inherited these incredible democratic values and freedoms, and that also includes our religious freedom, the right to practice our faith, the right to hold assemblies, the right to attend churches. And these are vital that we secure them, that we do everything we can to protect the values that we've been given from previous generations. So we need to pray for our peace and safety. And I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.